And welcome to another screencast where this time we'll be discussing the autonomic nervous system. I know it says cranial and spinal nerves there, but that's not right. We're going to do autonomic nervous system here. So by the end of this, you should be able to compare and contrast. This is a little bit different verbs than what we normally have on here, but you want to look at the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system with regard to which organs are their effector organs, the types of neurotransmitters that are used, and then the patterns of the motor pathways. This patterns here is we're talking about sort of the anatomy of the motor pathways, and then looking at the anatomy of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. And then back down here, number 3, identifying and describing the site and origin and the results of stimulation of several organs by the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So what this means is, what does the body do? What happens to the body? What happens to several different organs of the body when we stimulate them parasympathetically versus when we stimulate them parasympathetically? Right? So just to sort of set the scene here and remind us where we are not talking about anything over here with this sensory afferent division over here. We are solely looking at this efferent division, and we're looking at motor output here only. So the first thing I'll do is compare this somatic versus the autonomic. Right? So this is the first part of this. And then the second part of this is going to be looking at the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic divisions here. So motor only with this, nothing sensory coming in at all. So somatic versus the autonomic nervous system first. The somatic nervous system, these motor neurons are innervating skeletal muscles only. And so the pattern is that we have from the motor cortex, so this is the precentral gyrus right here, so this is the motor cortex of the brain, and action potentials are going to originate here and move down through tracts to nuclei either in the midbrain region or move down to nuclei that are in the ventral gray horns or the anterior gray horns of the spinal cord. They're then going to synapse with motor neurons that will then leave the cord and innervate skeletal muscle, or leave the brain nuclei here to innervate again skeletal muscle. Right? So that is the somatic nervous system, and generally these are under voluntary and involuntary control. So to contrast that then with anatomically and functionally, the autonomic nervous system, these are largely unconscious action potentials that are going to originate in visceral motor nuclei in the hypothalamus, right? So motor nuclei here in the hypothalamus, a deeper part of the brain. And so we have action potentials originating here and then synapsing at nuclei in the brainstem, as well as synapsing with at nuclei that are going to be in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. So then we have one synapse there. Then you're going to have neurons that leave the cord here and will synapse at a ganglion that is lateral, that is outside of the central nervous system. So then this is again a collection of cell bodies. Right? So this would be the equivalent of a nucleus in the central nervous system here. So we're going to have synapses at these ganglia, and then here's another autonomic ganglion right here. And then we have a third neuron then that will move from that ganglion to innervate the organs, either smooth muscle, glands, cardiac muscle, or fat cells, adipocytes. Right? Pardon me. So stimulation by any autonomic nervous system part is going to get some sort of response by these visceral effector organs here. So somatic versus the autonomic comparisons. Here there are typically only two neurons involved. Here we have at least 3 neurons involved with the anatomy here, with the moving of information from the central nervous system out to the periphery effector organs. It might be a good idea to pause and summarize those differences. So let's talk about the sympathetic stimulation here. So the sympathetic stimulation of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system typically involves a fight or flight response by the organ that it innervates. Right? So if we look at this diagram here, here is of course, the brain, and then the spinal cord here, and then branching off of that, we are going to have we're going to be looking at the second and the third cells here. So what we're not seeing is, of course, the hypothalamic nuclei, and then the axon coming down and synapsing here in the gray, in the anterior gray horn. But then we have the secondary and tertiary neurons here. One that leaves the cord on the ventral side. So these neurons leave the cord on the ventral side. Will synapse at a ganglion, and we see that there's this string of ganglia lateral to the cord, and this is known as the sympathetic chain ganglion, or sympathetic chain ganglia. So we see that diagrammed and labeled over here, that these are in a chain, right, that are anatomically lateral to the cord. So let's stay on this side of the diagram over here. So here we have our little spinal nerves, right, that are branching off of that cord, and at this ganglion we have a synapse, and then the tertiary neuron is then going to innervate the effector organ here. And so any of the black neurons in this are post-ganglia. They're post-ganglionic neurons, and the ones that are in red are the preganglionic neurons. So post and pre-ganglionic, and it's important to sort of pause here and get that distinction down. I'll just change color here. Get that distinction down, because they're often referred to that way when you're reading the text, and it can be confusing. So if you get this mental map in your mind, I think it might be a little bit easier for you to understand what you're reading. So the preganglionic neurons originate in the cord and then move out to either a ganglion there, where they're going to synapse with then a postganglionic neuron. These postganglionic neurons then will move away from the cord even more, and here we see a plexus. So this is a cardiac and pulmonary plexus. These cardiac and pulmonary plexuses and these collateral ganglion, right? So here's a collateral ganglion, here's a collateral ganglion, right? Here's a collateral ganglion. So these collateral ganglia are located directly on the surface, on the anterior surface of the aorta of the body. And if you look and see where the postganglionic neurons are going for these, they're going to organs of the abdomen, going to the organs of the abdomen, small intestine, large intestine, liver, stomach, pancreas, etc. One of these I want to point out right here is very special, the one that's going to the adrenal medulla. You notice that there is no post-ganglionic neuron there. You have a direct shot from the spinal cord to the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, then the synapse in the adrenal medulla is where you are going to directly stimulate the neurons. There are special neurons in here that will release norepinephrine neurotransmitter, or epinephrine, right, or noradrenaline, or just adrenaline. Right? And so this is a special case where you don't get a postganglionic fiber. The postganglionic fibers are modified there to be releasing the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into the bloodstream. So everything else, though, has a post-secondary or a post-ganglionic neuron that will then innervate the associated organ. And rather than sort of thinking about exactly what's going to happen each time, I think it's helpful to think about it fight or flight. So if I stimulate the eye sympathetically, the iris is going to contract, and you're going to get a much larger pupil, right, to get more light in. Right? Heart rate is going to go up. Right? Your breathing rate will go up to deliver more oxygen. Right? The stomach and large intestine, these things, the digestive system generally slows down upon that. The adrenal medulla, we're going to increase the secretions of adrenaline into the bloodstream. Right? So thinking about what would the body need in order to fight or flight, increase oxygen, increase nutrients into the bloodstream. Stimulation by the parasympathetic division then yields typically the opposite effects, right? The rest and digest responses. First, a little bit of the anatomy. Again, we have the parasympathetic neurons. Again, there's only going to be 2 neurons, so here we are seeing the second one of the 2, and we see them coming off of the midbrain and some of the brainstem, as well as then in the sacral region. So these neuron fibers come off of the cord, again, ventrally, but will only have 1 neuron, and those neurons then innervate the organ that it's innervating, but there will be a synapse, there will be a ganglion, but the ganglion is far away from the cord. So the sympathetic, to contrast this with sympathetic, you'd have that sympathetic chain ganglia here, right, very close to the cord, but the ganglia for these neurons then are for this parasympathetic division is extremely far away and almost very close to the organ. So we can refer to these as terminal ganglia that they serve. So there is, again, there's going to be a pre and a post ganglionic fiber, but the post ganglionic fibers in the parasympathetic division are very short compared with longer in the sympathetic division. So you should be able to see that here. Right here is the very short postganglionic, very short postganglionic, very short postganglionic, etc. Right? So the effects of stimulation by these neurons is to produce sort of a rest and digest situation here. Right? So heart rate, easiest example, the heart rate's going to kind of go down. Secretions for digestion are going to go up. Right? Production of urine will go up, etc. Okay? So thinking about what the body would do in a resting and digesting situation. Here's another schematic diagram to contrast, first of all, somatic nervous system versus the autonomic. Right? Again, these are all motor here. And then, so the somatic nervous system, here we have long neurons. Right? There is no ganglia involved here. We just have then acetylcholine stimulating skeletal muscle, right, or signaling skeletal muscle there. In the autonomic nervous system, we've got a sympathetic and a parasympathetic division to these 2 things. In the sympathetic division, we have short preganglionic. So here are relatively short preganglionic and then longer postganglionic fibers. Again, short preganglionic. Right? And in the case of the adrenal medulla, there is no postganglionic. We just innervate the adrenal medulla, the middle part of this, directly. Then in the parasympathetic division, we have longer preganglionic and shorter postganglionic ones. What is common between these, however, is that we're using acetylcholine, right, as the neurotransmitters. In the sympathetic division, the post-secondary neurons are releasing norepinephrine. And again, so here we see the post-ganglionic fibers releasing norepinephrine, and here we see that happening down here as well. But they are now hormones that are going to go into the bloodstream there. Over here we see the target or effector organs, right, smooth muscle, glands, cardiac muscle, and we'll throw adipocytes on here as well. Okay. So schematic, therefore, comparing and contrasting somatic and autonomic, and then again the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. This table summarizes, is pretty big, this table 8.5 summarizes, again, what the effects are for sympathetic stimulation, what the effects are for parasympathetic stimulation. So generally these are excitatory, right? For sympathetic, they're excitatory and getting the body to do something involved with fight or flight. And the parasympathetic stimulation is also excitatory, but it's going to cause something that is going to happen that makes the body rest or digest. So this is a little confusing sometimes to students because we are stimulating. You're thinking like, okay, rest, the body is resting, is slowing down. Yes, but you're still stimulating the body to do that. You're telling the body to slow the heart rate down, to slow the breathing rate down. So you're doing that by stimulating it with action potentials, with neurotransmitters released from those post-ganglionic neurons. Okay. So you should be able now to, of course, compare, contrast somatic and autonomic with regards to the effector organs, the neurotransmitters, and then patterns of the motor pathways. Anatomy of the parasympathetic and sympathetic. And then down here, this is that, doing this is essentially that table 8.5, okay? Being able to tell me what happens to a specific organ when you stimulate it parasympathetically versus sympathetically. Okay, I'm sure there are some questions or confusion, so bring them to class, and thanks for listening.